The dust from 100 hooves hung thick in the Colorado air as Clara Whitmore stepped from her father's gleaming Packard automobile, her silk gloves already damp with perspiration. The Grand Valley Livestock Auction stretched before her like an alien world, a chaos of bellowing cattle, shouting men, and the acrid smell of sweat and leather that seemed to cling to everything. She had never imagined such a place could exist so close to the manicured lawns and crystal chandeliers of her family's estate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, but fortune has a way of leading us exactly where we need to be, even when we resist every step of the journey. The year was 1923, and Millbrook County, Colorado was experiencing the kind of prosperity that made men forget their humility and women forget their place. The Great War had ended, the stock market was soaring, and Theodore Whitmore's First National Bank of Millbrook had grown fat on the dreams of farmers and ranchers who believed the good times would never end. In this world of automobile dealers and electric lights, where jazz music drifted from phonographs and young women dared to show their ankles, there existed an unspoken hierarchy as rigid as the mountains that surrounded their valley. At the top of this social mountain sat families like the Whitmores, their wealth measured not just in dollars, but in bloodlines that trace back to the railroad barons who had carved civilization from wilderness. Theodore Whitmore commanded respect. With his perfectly waxed mustache, gold pocket watch, and the kind of authority that came from holding the mortgages on half the county, his wife Martha had perfected the art of charitable condescension, organizing ladies' auxiliary meetings where she dispensed wisdom about proper behavior while never forgetting to mention her family's connections to Denver society. And then there was Clara, their only daughter, a young woman of 22 who had been molded like precious clay into the perfect banker's daughter. Every morning she woke in a bedroom larger than most people's homes, with wallpaper imported from France and furniture that had traveled by rail from the finest craftsmen in Chicago. Her days were structured around piano lessons, French tutoring, and carefully chaperoned social calls with other young ladies of suitable breeding. She could recite poetry in 3 languages, arrange flowers with artistic precision, and navigate the complex rules of high society with the grace of a dancer. But beneath the surface of this perfectly orchestrated life, Clara felt like a bird in a gilded cage, her wings growing weak from disuse. She had read every book in her father's extensive library twice, memorized every piece of sheet music her piano teacher brought, and mastered every needlepoint pattern her mother deemed appropriate. The walls of her privileged existence seemed to close in a little more each day, decorated though they were with the finest things money could buy. The expectations placed upon her were as heavy as the diamond necklace she wore to formal dinners. She was to marry well, meaning someone with the right connections and sufficient wealth to enhance the Whitmore name. Her father had already begun introducing her to suitable young men, the sons of cattle barons and mining magnates who visited their home for elaborate dinner parties. These men spoke of business ventures and investment opportunities with the same passion other people reserved for love, their eyes lighting up when they discussed profit margins rather than poetry. Clara played her part with practiced perfection, smiling at the right moments, laughing politely at jokes that weren't funny, and never expressing an opinion that might be considered too bold or independent. She had learned early that a woman's worth in their circle was measured by her ability to enhance her husband's reputation while never overshadowing it. Intelligence was acceptable as long as it remained decorative, like a beautiful painting that impressed guests but never challenged their assumptions. The irony was not lost on her that her father's wealth came from understanding the dreams and struggles of ordinary people, yet she was forbidden from having any meaningful contact with the very folks whose labors supported their lifestyle. She knew the names on the loan applications, had overheard conversations about drought-stricken farmers and ranchers struggling to make payments, but these people remained as distant to her as characters in a novel. Martha Whitmore had made it clear from Clara's earliest years that associating with the working class was not just inappropriate, but dangerous. "They're different from us, dear," she would say, with the kind of gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "It's not their fault." "Of course, but they simply don't understand the responsibilities that come with our position in society. We must be charitable toward them, but never forget the distance that propriety requires." This distance had been maintained through careful orchestration of Clara's entire life. She attended private schools, where the daughters of bankers and businessmen learned together in elegant isolation. Her social circle consisted entirely of young women whose fathers owned the largest ranches, the most successful businesses, or held the most important positions in county government. Even their charitable work was conducted at arm's length, organizing fundraisers and donation drives rather than direct contact with those they claimed to help. Clara had accepted this isolation as natural for most of her life, but recently something had begun to stir within her that she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the books she'd been reading, stories of adventure and romance that took place in worlds far removed from drawing rooms and dinner parties. Perhaps it was the music drifting from the dance halls downtown, melodies that spoke of passion and freedom in ways her classical training never had. Or perhaps it was simply the natural rebellion of a young woman who had been told too many times what she could and couldn't do. The restlessness had grown stronger with each passing week, like a tide that couldn't be held back by the carefully constructed sea walls of propriety. She found herself staring out her bedroom window toward the distant mountains, wondering what lay beyond the manicured boundaries of her father's world. She had begun taking longer walks around the estate, pushing the limits of where a proper young lady should venture, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity about the lives of people she'd never been allowed to know. It was this curiosity that had led to the events of that fateful day at the Grand Valley Livestock Auction. Theodore Whitmore had business there, something about a loan default and the need to assess the value of livestock being sold to satisfy a debt. Normally, he would have sent one of his associates to handle such matters, but this particular case involved significant money and required his personal attention. Clara had overheard the conversation and, in a moment of unprecedented boldness, had asked to accompany him. "Absolutely not," had been her mother's immediate response. "That's no place for a lady, Clara. The very idea is preposterous." But Clara had persisted with a determination that surprised even herself. "I've never seen how our business actually works, Father. Shouldn't I understand what supports our family's position?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How can I be a proper wife to a businessman if I don't understand business? It was a clever argument, appealing to both her father's pride in his work and his desire to see her well prepared for marriage to someone of suitable standing. After much discussion and against Martha's vigorous protests, Theodore had agreed with strict conditions. Clara would remain close to him at all times, would not speak to anyone without his permission, and would leave immediately if he deemed the situation inappropriate for a lady. And so Clara found herself stepping from the family Packard into a world that might as well have been another planet. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, where her daily life was characterized by quiet elegance and carefully modulated voices. The auction buzzed with raw energy and unfiltered emotion. Men in worn boots and sweat-stained hats gestured wildly as they examined cattle. their voices carrying across the dusty ground with an honesty that was both refreshing and shocking to someone accustomed to the measured politeness of high society. The auction yard itself was a marvel of organized chaos. Wooden pens held hundreds of cattle, their varied colors and sizes creating a patchwork that stretched as far as Clara could see. Cowboys moved among them with easy confidence, their movements economical and purposeful in ways that spoke of years spent working with animals. The smell was overwhelming at first, a mixture of dust, leather, manure, and something else she couldn't identify, but that seemed to speak of honest labor and authentic living. Theodore Whitmore looked distinctly uncomfortable in this environment, his city suit and polished shoes marking him as clearly as if he wore a sign announcing his status as an outsider. He consulted his pocket watch frequently and kept his handkerchief pressed to his nose, his distaste for the surroundings evident in every gesture. "Stay close, Clara," he murmured, his voice tight with barely concealed anxiety. "We'll conduct our business quickly and leave." But Clara found herself captivated rather than repelled by the scene before her. There was something vital and immediate about this world that made her own existence seem pale by comparison. These men weren't concerned with proper etiquette or social positioning. They were focused on the practical business of buying and selling the livestock that fed the nation. Their handshakes seemed to carry more weight than all the formal contracts in her father's office, their word given with a gravity that impressed her more than any elegant dinner party conversation ever had. As they made their way through the crowd toward the auction platform, Clara noticed how the men around them seemed to occupy their space with complete confidence. They knew their business, understood the value of what they were examining, and conducted themselves with a kind of practical dignity that she had never encountered in her carefully orchestrated social circles. These weren't men who worried about which fork to use or whether their conversation was sufficiently witty. They were focused on the real work of life, the raising and trading of animals that sustained entire communities. The auction itself was a revelation. The auctioneer's rapid-fire chatter created a rhythm that seemed almost musical, his voice rising and falling as bids flew from all corners of the crowd. Clara watched in fascination as men who had seemed rough and uncultured in her father's world revealed themselves to be shrewd businessmen, their eyes sharp with intelligence as they evaluated each animal and calculated its worth with lightning speed. It was during this mesmerizing display that Clara first noticed him, though she wouldn't know his name until much later. Daniel Hayes stood near one of the cattle pens, his attention focused entirely on a group of horses that were scheduled for the afternoon auction. There was something about his stillness amid all the commotion that drew her eye, the way he seemed completely at ease in surroundings that intimidated even her confident father. Danny, as everyone called him, was 26 years old and had spent every one of those years learning the hard lessons that came with working the land. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his hands scarred by barbed wire and rope burns, his body lean and strong from the kind of labor that shaped a man from the inside out. He wore the same kind of worn boots and faded shirt as the other cowboys, but there was something in his bearing that set him apart, a quiet confidence that came not from social position, but from genuine competence. He had arrived at the auction before dawn, having ridden the 15 miles from his small ranch through the pre-dawn darkness. The horses he was examining weren't for sale. They belonged to a neighbor who had asked him to assess their condition and advise on fair pricing. It was the kind of favor that neighbors did for each other in ranch country, where a man's reputation was built on his willingness to help and his knowledge of livestock. Danny had grown up on this land, the son of a ranch hand who had worked for the big spreads until he saved enough to buy his own small plot. It wasn't much, barely enough to support a modest herd and a simple house, but it was his own. He had inherited not just the land, but the values that came with it. The importance of hard work, the necessity of self-reliance, and the belief that a man's worth was measured by his actions rather than his bank account. The contrast between his world and Clara's couldn't have been more complete. Where she woke to servants bringing breakfast on silver trays, he rose before sunrise to check on animals and repair whatever the previous day's work had broken. Where she spent her days in pursuits designed to make her more attractive to potential husbands, he focused on the practical skills needed to make a living from stubborn land and unpredictable weather. Where she was surrounded by luxury and comfort, he had learned to find satisfaction in simple things. A job well done, a horse gentled through patience rather than force, the sight of healthy cattle grazing on grass he had planted and tended. Yet both of them, unknown to each other, were struggling with a sense that something essential was missing from their lives. Clara felt trapped by expectations that had nothing to do with her actual desires or capabilities. Danny found himself working alone on his ranch, competent and self-sufficient, but increasingly aware of the loneliness that came with his independence. Neither could have imagined that their paths were about to cross in a way that would change both their lives forever. As the morning wore on and the auction continued, Clara found herself growing more comfortable in the unfamiliar environment. Her father remained focused on his business, consulting with the auctioneer about the cattle being sold to satisfy the defaulted loan. But Clara's attention began to wander. She watched the easy camaraderie between the cowboys, the way they evaluated livestock with practiced eyes, the respect they showed for the animals, even in the commercial context of buying and selling. It was nearing noon when the atmosphere in the auction yard began to change. The morning's cattle sales were winding down, and the afternoon horse auction was about to begin. Someone had mentioned that a particularly fine group of quarter horses was going to be sold, animals that had been bred for both beauty and performance. Word spread through the crowd, and more people began gathering around the pen where the horses waited. Clara noticed the shift in energy, the way conversations became more animated, and men began positioning themselves for better views of the coming auction. Her father was still occupied with his business, speaking in low tones with bank associates about the morning's sales, but Clara found herself drawn toward the growing crowd around the horse pen. She didn't notice Danny Hayes, moving in the same direction, his practiced eye already assessing the horses that would soon be led into the auction ring. She didn't see him frown slightly as he observed something about the animals' behavior that concerned him, a subtle nervousness that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the noise and commotion of the auction environment. What she did notice was the beauty of the horses themselves, their sleek coats gleaming in the afternoon sun, their proud bearing even in the confines of the pen. These weren't the gentle carriage horses she was accustomed to seeing, animals trained for sedate rides around the estate. These were working horses, bred for speed and endurance, their eyes bright with intelligence and barely contained energy. The crowd continued to grow, and Clara found herself pressed closer to the pen than she had intended. The noise level rose as more people arrived, their voices adding to the general commotion of the auction yard. Someone near the back of the crowd shouted something, and the sound carried across the pen with unexpected sharpness. That's when everything began to go wrong. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across clear skies. Danny Hayes felt it before he heard it, that subtle vibration through the ground that spoke of something large moving fast. His years working with horses had taught him to read the signs that others missed, and right now every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. The quarter horses in the pen had gone rigid, their ears swiveling toward a sound that human ears couldn't yet detect. Their nostrils flared as they tested the air, and Danny saw the telltale tightening around their eyes that meant fight or flight was about to take over rational thought. He started moving toward the pen, pushing through the crowd with polite but firm determination. "Excuse me, pardon me," he murmured, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But the crowd was thick, excited about the upcoming auction, and his progress was frustratingly slow. Clara stood near the fence, completely unaware of the brewing catastrophe. She had positioned herself where she could see the horses clearly, fascinated by their obvious intelligence and barely contained power. These animals were nothing like the docile carriage horses she knew, and their wild beauty captivated her in a way she couldn't explain. The rumble grew louder, and suddenly the crowd could hear it too. Heads turned toward the western edge of the auction yard, where a cloud of dust was rising like a brown thunderhead against the blue Colorado sky. Someone shouted, and the word stampede rippled through the gathered people like a stone thrown into still water. A herd of perhaps 50 cattle had broken free from one of the holding pens, spooked by something no one would ever identify. They were running blind, driven by pure panic, their hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that spoke of unstoppable force. The auction yard erupted into chaos as people scattered in all directions, some running for safety, others trying to help contain the situation. The quarter horses in the pen heard the approaching thunder of hooves and felt their own ancient instincts awakening. These were prey animals, designed by millions of years of evolution to run first and think later when danger threatened. The fact that they were contained behind wooden rails only made their panic more intense. Danny was still 20 feet from the pen when the first horse reared, its front hooves pawing the air as it voiced a shrill whinny of distress. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade, and suddenly all 6 horses in the pen were moving. Their bodies pressed against the fence as they sought escape from the perceived threat. Clara heard the commotion behind her and turned to see what was happening. The sight of the stampeding cattle sent a chill of fear down her spine, but she was too fascinated by the drama unfolding to think about her own safety. She had never seen anything like this raw display of nature's power, and despite the danger, she found herself unable to look away. That's when the wooden rail beside her splintered. The largest of the quarter horses, a magnificent stallion with a coat the color of burnished copper, had thrown his full weight against the fence. The wood, dried by Colorado sun and weakened by years of use, gave way with a crack like a gunshot. The horse burst through the opening, his eyes white-rimmed with terror, and suddenly Clara found herself directly in the path of 1,200 pounds of panicked animal. Time seemed to slow as she realized her danger. The stallion was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, his muscles bunched for another leap that would carry him right over her. She could see the individual hairs of his mane flowing like liquid fire, could smell the sweet scent of hay and leather and something wilder that spoke of open ranges and mountain meadows. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. The elegant silk dress that marked her as a lady of quality had become a trap, its narrow skirt restricting her movement just when she needed it most. Her fashionable shoes, perfect for drawing-room conversations, provided no grip on the dusty ground. She was frozen, a statue in expensive clothing, while death approached on 4 legs. Danny saw the fence give way and the horse break free, saw Clara standing directly in the animal's path like a flower in the road. There was no time to think, no time to calculate odds or consider consequences. His body moved before his mind, caught up, years of working with dangerous animals, condensing into pure instinct. He covered the distance in a handful of strides, his boots finding purchase on ground that would have betrayed a less experienced man. He could hear the stallion's breathing, could feel the tremor in the earth as those powerful hooves struck dirt. The horse was committed to his leap now, airborne for a moment that stretched like eternity. Danny hit Clara at full speed, his arms wrapping around her waist as he carried them both sideways and down. They hit the ground hard, rolling in a tangle of limbs and fabric as the stallion thundered past, so close that Clara felt the wind of his passage and heard the whistle of air. Through his nostrils For a moment they lay still in the dust, Danny's body covering hers protectively while the chaos continued around them. Clara could feel his heart hammering against her back, could smell the honest scent of leather and sweat and something indefinably masculine that made her head spin in ways that had nothing to do with their rough landing. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough with adrenaline and concern, his breath warm against her ear as he spoke. She tried to answer but found that words had deserted her entirely. No one had ever held her like this, with such strength and such gentleness combined. No one had ever risked their own safety for hers, without thought of reward or recognition. Danny pulled back slightly, his hands moving over her arms and shoulders with the same careful attention he would give to an injured animal, checking for breaks or sprains. His touch was entirely proper, yet somehow more intimate than anything she had ever experienced. When his fingers brushed against her wrist to check for injury, she felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with fear. I think I'm all right," she managed to whisper, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Something fundamental had shifted inside her during those terrifying seconds, something that had less to do with physical injury and more to do with the way this stranger had appeared from nowhere to place himself between her and danger. Danny helped her to her feet, his movements careful and considerate. He brushed the dust from her dress with the same gentle efficiency he had used to check for injuries, and Clara found herself studying his face for the first time. It was a good face, she decided, weathered but honest, with lines around the eyes, that spoke of squinting into sun and wind rather than sitting in comfortable offices. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused, but gentle, the hands of someone who worked with his body rather than just his mind. "Thank you," she said, and the simple words seemed inadequate for what had just passed between them. He had saved her life without hesitation, without even knowing who she was. The men in her social circle spoke constantly of honor and duty, but she had never seen either quality demonstrated so purely or so selflessly. "Just glad you're safe, miss," Danny replied, and Clara noticed that he didn't meet her eyes when he spoke. There was something in his manner that suggested he was already regretting his impulsive action, already calculating the social cost of what he had done, because the cost would be significant, and they both knew it. A ranch hand didn't touch a banker's daughter, not even to save her life without consequences. In the rigid social hierarchy of Millbrook County, there were invisible boundaries that weren't crossed, unspoken rules that governed every interaction between the classes. Danny had violated those rules in the most public way possible, and now they would both have to face the aftermath. The immediate chaos was beginning to subside as cowboys and auction workers succeeded in controlling the stampeding cattle and the spooked horses. The stallion that had nearly trampled Clara was being led away by two experienced hands, his copper coat dark with sweat, but his panic subsiding now that the immediate threat had passed. Other horses were being returned to makeshift pens while workers began assessing the damage to fences and equipment, but Clara barely noticed any of this. Her attention was entirely focused on the man who had saved her, this stranger who had appeared like something from one of the adventure novels she read in secret. She wanted to know his name, wanted to understand what kind of life produced such quick courage and such gentle strength. The questions burned in her throat, but before she could voice them, her father's voice cut through the settling dust like a whip crack. "Clara! Dear God, Clara, what happened?" Theodore Whitmore was pushing through the crowd with the desperate energy of a man who had just realized his most precious possession was in danger. His face was pale beneath his carefully groomed mustache, his usual composure completely shattered by the sight of his daughter disheveled and dusty in the middle of the auction yard. He reached them just as Danny was stepping back, the cowboy's instinctive understanding of social boundaries reasserting itself now that the immediate crisis had passed. Theodore's eyes swept over Clara, noting her torn dress and dirt-stained gloves, before settling on Danny with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant gratitude. "This man saved me, father," Clara said quickly, sensing the tension in the air between the two men. "The horses broke free, and he—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain how to describe what had happened, without making it sound even more scandalous than it already was. "I see," Theodore said slowly, his banker's mind already calculating the implications of what he was hearing. His daughter had been alone with a strange man, had been touched by him, had been saved by him in front of half the county. It was the kind of situation that created gossip and speculation, the kind of story that would be told and retold until the truth was buried beneath layers of assumption and innuendo. Danny seemed to understand the older man's dilemma because he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respectful dismissal. "She's safe now, sir. That's all that matters." He started to turn away, clearly intending to disappear back into the crowd before the situation became any more complicated than it already was. But Clara surprised them both by reaching out to stop him, her gloved hand touching his arm with a boldness that made her father's eyebrows rise toward his hairline. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that neither man had heard from her before. "I don't even know your name." "Danny Hayes, miss," he replied, his hat still in his hands as he spoke. "I work the Hayes Ranch, about 15 miles south of here." There was pride in his voice when he mentioned the ranch, the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from owning something earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. "Danny Hayes," Clara repeated, as if testing the sound of the name on her tongue. It was a simple name, honest and unpretentious, nothing like the elaborate surnames of the young men her parents introduced her to at dinner parties. Those names came with histories and expectations, with trust funds and business connections. This name came with calloused hands and genuine courage. Theodore Whitmore watched this exchange with growing unease. He could see something in his daughter's eyes that he had never seen before, a kind of awakening awareness that made his protective instincts flare like a warning fire. This was exactly the kind of situation he had feared when he agreed to bring her to the auction, exactly the kind of complication that could arise when carefully maintained social boundaries were disrupted by unexpected events. "Mr. Hayes," he said formally, extending his hand in the kind of gesture that acknowledged debt while maintaining distance. "My family is grateful for your quick action. If there's anything we can do—" He let the offer hang in the air, vague enough to be polite, but specific enough to suggest that monetary compensation was the appropriate response to the situation. Danny shook the offered hand briefly, his grip firm but not challenging. "No need for that, sir. Anyone would have done the same." It was a diplomatic response that declined the implied offer while avoiding offense. The kind of careful navigation that suggested he understood the social undercurrents of the situation better than his rough appearance might suggest. But Clara wasn't ready to let the moment pass so easily. Something had awakened in her during those terrifying seconds, something that had less to do with gratitude and more to do with a sudden awareness of possibilities she had never considered. This man had risked himself for her without knowing. Her name or her social position had acted from pure instinct and fundamental decency rather than calculated advantage. "Perhaps you could visit us," she said impulsively, ignoring her father's sharp intake of breath, "for dinner, so we can properly thank you." The words hung in the air like sparks from a fire, dangerous and bright and impossible to take back. Unspoken, the silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Danny's eyes flicked between Clara and her father, reading the tension in the older man's posture and the determination in the young woman's face. He was experienced enough with social dynamics to understand that he was being offered something that could be either a great honor or a terrible trap depending on how it was handled. Theodore Whitmore's face had gone through several shades of color during his daughter's impulsive invitation, settling finally on a carefully controlled, neutral expression that fooled no one. "Clara," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this later, when you've had time to recover from your ordeal." But Clara had tasted something new in that moment of rescue, something that made her previous life seem pale and constrained by comparison. The man standing before her represented a world she had never been allowed to explore, a life based on authentic experience rather than social expectation. The invitation had been spoken impulsively, but now that the words were out, she meant them completely. "I mean it," she said, her voice steady despite the revolutionary nature of what she was proposing. "You saved my life, Mr. Hayes. The least we can do is offer you a proper meal and our sincere thanks." Danny looked at her for a long moment, and Clara found herself holding her breath as she waited for his response. She could see him weighing the implications of accepting, could almost hear his mind calculating the potential consequences of entering. A world where he clearly didn't belong. But there was something else in his expression too, a spark of curiosity that matched her own. "That's very kind of you, miss," he said finally, his voice careful and measured. "But I'm not sure that would be appropriate. Your father's right that you should rest and recover from what happened here today." It was a polite refusal, the kind of diplomatic response that acknowledged the honor of the invitation while declining to complicate an already delicate situation. But Clara heard something else in his tone, a reluctance that suggested the refusal wasn't as definitive as his words made it sound. "Mr. Hayes," she said, stepping closer and lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "I've spent my entire life being appropriate. Perhaps it's time I tried something different." The words surprised her as much as they surprised him. She had never spoken so boldly to anyone, never acknowledged so directly the constraints that shaped her daily existence. But something about this man's honest courage had awakened a corresponding honesty in her own heart, a willingness to speak truths that had been buried beneath years of careful training in proper behavior. Danny's eyes met hers for the first time since the rescue, and Clara felt that same jolt of electricity she had experienced when he checked her for injuries. There was intelligence in those eyes, and kindness, and something else that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't entirely understand. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, and she realized she had never told him her name. The fact that he knew it suggested that her family's reputation preceded her, that even in his world of honest labor and practical concerns, the Whitmore name carried weight and recognition. "How did you know?" she asked, genuinely curious about how information traveled between their very different social circles. "Your father's automobile?" Danny explained with a slight smile. "Not many Packards in Millbrook County, and only one belongs to the president of First National Bank. Doesn't take much figuring from there." The explanation made Clara realize how completely she had been living in a bubble, isolated not just from the working people of the county, but from their awareness of her family's prominence. To her, the Packard was simply transportation, as natural and unremarkable as the servants who maintained it, or the chauffeur who drove it when her father was occupied with business. She had never considered how such luxury appeared to someone who earned his living with his hands. "I see," she said, and for the first time began to understand the vast gulf that separated their daily experiences. Yet somehow, in the space of a few terrifying minutes, that gulf had been bridged by something more fundamental than social position or economic status. He had seen her not as the banker's daughter, but simply as a person in danger, and she had seen him not as a ranch hand, but as someone willing to risk everything for a stranger's safety. The crowd around them was beginning to thin as people either left the auction or moved on to other business, but Theodore Whitmore remained planted beside his daughter like a sentinel. His discomfort with the entire situation was evident in every line of his body, from his rigid posture to the way his fingers drummed against his pocket watch. This was exactly the kind of complication he had feared when he agreed to bring Clara to the auction, exactly the kind of boundary crossing that could have serious social consequences. Yet he couldn't deny his genuine gratitude to the young man who had saved his daughter's life. Without Danny's quick action, Clara might have been seriously injured or worse, and no amount of social awkwardness could outweigh that debt. The conflict between his protective instincts as a father and his rigid adherence to social norms was written clearly across his face. "Perhaps," he said slowly, clearly choosing his words with great care, "we could arrange some appropriate token of our appreciation, a bank draft or—" He trailed off, realizing that offering money to someone who had just saved his daughter's life might be more insulting than generous. Danny shook his head politely but firmly. "I appreciate the thought, sir, but that's not necessary. Like I said, anyone would have done the same thing." There was dignity in his refusal, the kind of quiet pride that couldn't be bought or borrowed. He had acted from conscience rather than expectation of reward, and Clara found herself respecting him even more for his unwillingness to profit from his decency. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower across the auction yard, casting longer shadows and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The crisis had passed, the horses were contained, and normal business was beginning to resume around them. But nothing felt normal to Clara anymore. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world, and there was no going back to the comfortable ignorance she had enjoyed just an hour earlier. She looked at Danny Hayes standing there in his worn boots and faded shirt, hat in his hands and dust on his shoulders from their tumble to the ground, and she saw something she had never encountered in all her carefully orchestrated social interactions. She saw authenticity, the kind of genuine character that couldn't be taught in finishing schools or inherited with family names. And for the first time in her life, she understood what had been missing from her world of elegant conversations and proper behavior. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying a new note of determination that made both men look at her with surprise. "I insist that you allow us to thank you properly. Not with money," she added quickly, seeing him start to shake his head again, "but with hospitality, with the chance to show you that not all wealthy people are as disconnected from basic human decency as you might think." It was a bold statement, one that acknowledged the class differences between them while challenging the assumptions that usually govern such interactions. Clara was essentially admitting that her world was insulated and artificial, while simultaneously asserting that she wanted to be different, wanted to bridge the gap that society insisted must separate them. Danny studied her face for a long moment, and Clara had the feeling he was seeing her clearly for the first time, looking past the expensive dress and careful grooming to something more essential underneath. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him because his expression softened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You might be surprised, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "by how much basic human decency exists in places you've never been allowed to look." The invitation was extended despite Theodore Whitmore's obvious reluctance, and Danny Hayes found himself agreeing to something that violated every unwritten rule of their stratified society. Clara's persistence had worn down both men's resistance, though for entirely different reasons. Her father capitulated because he recognized the steel beneath his daughter's silk exterior when she truly wanted something, while Danny accepted because he saw in her eyes a genuine desire to understand a world she had never been permitted to explore. The Whitmore estate sat on the hill overlooking Millbrook like a declaration of prosperity, its manicured lawns and imposing architecture announcing to everyone below exactly where power resided in their community. As Danny approached the front gates 3 evenings later, mounted on his best horse and wearing his only good suit, he felt the weight of generations of class distinction pressing down on him like a physical force. The suit had belonged to his father, carefully preserved and only worn for weddings, funerals, and the occasional trip to the bank for business that couldn't be conducted in work clothes. It fit reasonably well, though the shoulders were slightly too broad and the trousers an inch too short, marking him as clearly as a badge might have done as someone unaccustomed to formal attire. He had spent the better part of an hour that morning cleaning and polishing his boots, but even his best efforts couldn't disguise the fact that they were working boots, designed for function rather than fashion. The gates themselves were wrought iron masterpieces decorated with scrollwork that spoke of European craftsmanship and old money sensibilities. A brass nameplate announced Whitmore Estate in elegant script, and Danny found himself hesitating before the entrance, suddenly aware of the enormous gulf between his world and the one he was about to enter. A groundskeeper appeared from a small cottage beside the gates, eyeing Danny with the kind of suspicious courtesy that servants reserved for visitors who didn't obviously belong. "You have business here?" the man asked, his tone polite but guarded. "Danny Hayes," he replied. "Simply, Miss Whitmore invited me for dinner." The groundskeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too well trained to comment on the unusual nature of the situation. Instead, he opened the gates and gestured toward the main house. "Follow the drive straight up, sir. Someone will meet you at the front door." The ride up the winding drive was a journey through carefully orchestrated beauty that bore no resemblance to the practical landscape Danny knew. Every tree was positioned for maximum aesthetic impact, every flower bed designed to complement the overall composition. It was nature tamed and shaped by human will and unlimited resources, impressive but somehow lifeless compared to the wild meadows and rough pastures of his ranch. The house itself was a monument to success, 3 stories of red brick and white, columns that spoke of old money and established power. Wide windows reflected the setting sun, and broad verandas suggested a lifestyle of leisure and contemplation. Danny had seen it from a distance many times, but approaching it directly made him understand for the first time just how vast the distance was between his modest ranch house and this temple to prosperity. A servant appeared before he could even dismount, a middle-aged man in formal livery who took the reins with practiced efficiency. "Good evening, sir," the man said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Miss Whitmore is expecting you." Danny followed the servant up the front steps, his boots echoing on marble that probably cost more than his entire annual income. The front door was massive, carved oak with brass fittings that gleamed like gold in the lamplight. Everything about the entrance was designed to impress and intimidate, to remind visitors of the wealth and power of those who lived within. The interior of the house was even more overwhelming than the exterior. The entry hall soared 2 stories high, its walls lined with oil paintings that Danny suspected were originals rather than reproductions. A crystal chandelier dominated the space, its faceted surfaces throwing rainbows across walls covered in silk wallpaper that looked imported and expensive. Furniture that belonged in museums rather than homes occupied strategic positions, each piece chosen for its beauty rather than its comfort. "Mr. Hayes," a familiar voice called from the top of the grand staircase, and Danny looked up to see Clara descending with a grace that spoke of years of training in proper deportment. She wore a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her eyes and made her skin glow in the soft light. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid considerable time to achieve, and pearls at her throat caught the light as she moved. Yet despite the formal elegance of her appearance, there was something different about her expression, a warmth and genuine pleasure at seeing him that hadn't been manufactured for social purposes. She was genuinely glad he had come, and that knowledge eased some of the tension Danny had been carrying since he passed through the front gates. "Thank you for accepting our invitation," she said, as she reached the bottom of the stairs, extending her hand in greeting. Danny took it carefully, aware that even this simple gesture was loaded with social significance in a world where unmarried ladies rarely touched men who weren't family members. "Thank you for having me, Miss Whitmore," he replied, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of his surroundings. "Your home is very beautiful." Clara smiled at the compliment, though Danny caught a flicker of something that might have been weariness in her expression. "It's certainly impressive," she agreed, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the difference between beauty and happiness, between luxury and contentment. Theodore Whitmore emerged from what Danny assumed was his study, looking every inch the successful banker in his perfectly tailored evening clothes. His greeting was cordial but cautious, the manner of a man fulfilling social obligations while remaining alert to potential complications. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending his hand in a firm handshake. "Welcome to our home. I trust you had no difficulty finding us?" "None at all, sir," Danny replied. "It's kind of you to have me." "Nonsense," Clara interjected, before her father could respond. "It's the least we can do for someone who showed such courage and quick thinking." There was pride in her voice when she spoke of his actions at the auction, a genuine admiration that made Danny's chest tighten in ways he hadn't expected. Mrs. Martha Whitmore appeared at that moment, descending the stairs with the kind of measured dignity that suggested she had timed her entrance for maximum effect. She was an elegant woman in her late 40s, her clothing and jewelry chosen to complement rather than compete with her daughter's beauty. But her smile was coolly polite, the expression of someone fulfilling social duties rather than experiencing genuine pleasure. "Mr. Hayes," she said, offering her hand with the kind of gracious condescension that wealthy ladies had perfected over generations. "How good of you to join us this evening." Danny took her hand briefly, sensing immediately that Mrs. Whitmore was less enthusiastic about his presence than her husband or daughter. She was evaluating him with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to judging people's worth based on their clothing, their manners, and their usefulness to her family's social position. "Thank you for having me, ma'am," he replied, instinctively understanding that this woman would be the most difficult to win over, if indeed winning over was possible or even desirable. "Shall we go into dinner?" Theodore suggested, clearly eager to move past the awkwardness of introductions and into the more structured environment of a formal meal. The dining room was another exercise in intimidating elegance, dominated by a table that could easily seat 20 people and was set with china and crystal that caught the light from another magnificent chandelier. Danny counted at least 4 different forks at his place setting and tried not to show his uncertainty about their proper use. Clara was seated to his right, and he found himself grateful for her presence as they navigated the complex ritual of a formal dinner. She guided him subtly through the maze of courses and cutlery, her manner so natural that he almost believed she was unaware of his discomfort with the elaborate proceedings. The conversation during the early courses was carefully neutral, touching on safe topics like the weather, the success of the autumn harvest, and general business conditions in the county. Danny answered questions about his ranch and his work with honest pride, though he was careful not to elaborate on the financial struggles that made every season a gamble against forces beyond his control. Mrs. Whitmore asked pointed questions about his family background and education, probing delicately but persistently for information that would help her categorize him properly in her social framework. Danny answered honestly, explaining that his father had been a ranch hand who saved enough to buy a small spread, and that his own education had consisted of local schooling supplemented by practical experience with livestock and land management. "How fascinating," Mrs. Whitmore said in a tone that suggested she found it anything but fascinating. It must be challenging to manage a ranch without the advantages of university training in business or agriculture. It was a subtle insult wrapped in polite inquiry, designed to highlight his lack of formal education while maintaining the fiction of social courtesy. Danny recognized the tactic and responded with quiet dignity. "You're right that it's challenging," he agreed. "But there's something to be said for learning by doing, for understanding cattle and horses from working with them every day rather than reading about them in books." Clara jumped into the conversation with enthusiasm that surprised everyone at the table. "I think practical experience is probably much more valuable than theoretical knowledge in most cases," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that made her parents exchange glances. After all, what good is knowing the theory behind something if you can't actually do it when it matters? It was an unexpectedly forceful statement from someone who had been raised to value education and refinement above practical skills, and Danny found himself looking at her with new respect. She wasn't just being polite to a guest. She was expressing genuine beliefs that suggested a mind capable of independent thought. "Surely you don't mean to dismiss the value of proper education, dear," her mother said, her tone carrying a warning that Clara was venturing into inappropriate territory. "Of course not," Clara replied, but there was steel beneath the silk in her voice. "I'm simply suggesting that different kinds of knowledge have different kinds of value. Mr. Hayes demonstrated the kind of quick thinking and decisive action that probably saved my life. I doubt very much that was something he learned from a textbook." The comment created an uncomfortable silence that stretched until Theodore cleared his throat and attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But the damage was done, or perhaps the revelation was complete. Clara had announced to her parents that she valued practical competence over social credentials, that she respected the man who had saved her for reasons that had nothing to do with his bank account or his family connections. As the evening progressed and more wine was consumed, the conversation gradually became more natural and less guarded. Danny found himself talking about his work with a passion that surprised even him, describing the satisfaction of raising healthy cattle, the challenge of managing grazing land during drought years, and the deep contentment that came from building something with his own hands. Clara listened with an intensity that made him self-conscious, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. She wanted to know about the daily routine of ranch life, about the relationship between ranchers and their animals, about the skills required to succeed in a profession that most people in her circle considered beneath their notice. "It sounds like such an honest way to live," she said during a lull in the conversation, her voice carrying a wistfulness that made her parents look at her sharply. "Everything you do has a clear purpose, and you can see the results of your work directly." "As opposed to what?" her father asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction his daughter's thoughts were taking. "As opposed to—" Clara hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "As opposed to arranging flowers and planning dinner parties and learning to paint watercolors that no one really wants to look at. As opposed to accomplishing things that matter only because they're what ladies are supposed to accomplish." It was a remarkably honest statement that revealed more about Clara's inner life than Danny suspected she had intended. Here was a young woman who had been given every advantage that money could buy, yet she felt trapped by the very luxuries that were supposed to make her happy. She envied him his purposeful work, his direct connection to the land and animals, that sustained life itself. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone pale during her daughter's unexpected confession. "Clara," she said sharply, "I hardly think this is an appropriate topic for dinner conversation." But Clara seemed to have found her voice and wasn't ready to be silenced. "Why isn't it appropriate, Mother? Why can't we talk about the fact that Women in our position are essentially decorative, that we're trained to be beautiful and agreeable and accomplish nothing of real significance. The rebellion in her voice was unmistakable now, and Danny realized he was witnessing something that had been building in Clara long before their chance meeting at the auction. His rescue had been the catalyst, but the dissatisfaction with her constrained life, had deeper roots than their brief acquaintance. "Because," Mrs. Whitmore replied with the kind of icy control that suggested a larger conversation would take place later, "a lady's role in society is to elevate and refine the world around her, not to engage in manual labor or concern herself with commercial enterprises." "But what if a lady wants to do more than elevate and refine?" Clara asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What if she wants to contribute something meaningful, to build rather than simply decorate?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Danny found himself holding his breath as he waited to see how the family would navigate this unexpected revelation of Clara's deeper feelings. He was beginning to understand that his presence at their dinner table was catalyzing conversations that might never have happened otherwise, forcing all of them to examine assumptions they had never questioned. Theodore Whitmore attempted to restore peace with the diplomatic skills that served him well in business. "Clara raises interesting points," he said carefully, "though I think we should remember that different people are suited for different roles in society. Mr. Hayes has found his calling in ranch work, just as Clara will find hers in managing a household and supporting her husband's career." But Clara wasn't ready to be diplomatically silenced. "And what if I don't want to spend my life supporting someone else's career?" she asked, her eyes flashing with an intensity that made her even more beautiful. "What if I want to accomplish something on my own?" It was a revolutionary statement for a young woman of her social position, a direct challenge to everything her parents had taught her about a woman's proper role in the world. Danny found himself admiring her courage, even as he recognized the dangerous ground she was treading. Mrs. Whitmore had clearly reached the limit of her tolerance for such unconventional ideas. "Clara," she said, in a voice that brooked no argument, "you are overwrought from your recent ordeal. Perhaps we should excuse ourselves and allow you to rest." But Clara remained seated, her jaw set with determination that reminded Danny of the moment she had insisted on inviting him to dinner, despite her father's obvious reluctance. "I'm not overwrought, Mother. I'm simply being honest about feelings I've had for a long time." The silence that followed was thick with tension and unspoken conflict. Danny realized he was witnessing a family crisis that had been brewing beneath the surface of polite conversation, and his presence had somehow given Clara the courage to voice dissatisfactions she had previously kept hidden. "Perhaps," he said, quietly, "I should take my leave. This seems like a conversation that should happen privately." "No!" Clara said immediately, turning to face him with an expression of desperate appeal. "Please don't go. You're the reason I finally found the courage to say what I've been thinking for months." The admission created another uncomfortable silence, and Danny realized that he had become more than just a dinner guest. He had become a symbol of the authentic life that Clara craved, the catalyst for her rebellion against the constraints of her privileged but limited existence. Theodore Whitmore looked at his daughter with something approaching alarm, clearly recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond simple gratitude for a rescue and into territory that could have serious consequences for the family's social standing and Clara's future prospects. "Mr. Hayes," he said carefully, "while we remain grateful for your assistance to Clara, I think perhaps we should discuss the appropriateness of future social interactions." It was a polite way of saying that Danny was no longer welcome, that whatever debt they owed him for saving Clara's life had been paid with this dinner, and that further contact would be inappropriate. Danny understood perfectly, had expected this moment from the beginning. But he found the dismissal more painful than he had anticipated. He started to rise from his chair, ready to thank them for their hospitality and disappear back into the world where he belonged. But Clara's hand on his arm stopped him, her touch light but unmistakably possessive. "Father," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that surprised everyone at the table. "Mr. Hayes is welcome in this house any time I choose to invite him, and I intend to invite him again." The challenge was direct and unmistakable, a daughter asserting her independence against parents who had never imagined she might rebel against their carefully laid plans for her future. The dinner party had become a battleground, and Danny found himself uncomfortably positioned at the center of a conflict that could reshape the Whitmore family forever. The weeks following the dinner brought consequences that rippled through Millbrook County like stones thrown into still water. Clara's defiance of her parents' expectations had not gone unnoticed by the carefully interconnected network of families that governed local society, and within days of Danny's visit to the Whitmore estate, whispers began circulating through drawing rooms and church gatherings. Mrs. Beatrice Carmichael, whose husband owned the largest cattle operation in the county, made it her personal mission to ensure that everyone understood the scandal brewing in their midst. At the weekly ladies' auxiliary meeting, she spoke with the kind of concerned authority that wealthy women used when discussing threats to the social order. "I heard it directly from Margaret Patterson, whose cousin works as a seamstress for the Whitmore household," she announced to the circle of elegantly dressed women gathered in her parlor. "Clara Whitmore has been seen riding out toward the Hayes Ranch, alone, without a chaperone or even proper escort." The gasps that greeted this revelation were entirely genuine. In a society where an unmarried woman's reputation could be destroyed by the slightest impropriety, the idea of a banker's daughter visiting a ranch hand unchaperoned was scandalous beyond comprehension. "Surely there must be some mistake," ventured Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, though her tone suggested she hoped there wasn't. Scandal was the lifeblood of their social gatherings, providing entertainment and moral superiority in equal measure. "I'm afraid not," Mrs. Carmichael replied with the satisfied tone of someone delivering deliciously shocking news. "And apparently she's been asking questions about ranch work, about cattle breeding and land management. Can you imagine a girl with her advantages concerning herself with such common pursuits?" The conversation continued in this vein for another hour, each woman contributing her own piece of gossip or speculation until Clara's reputation had been thoroughly dissected and found wanting. By the time the meeting ended, the consensus was clear. Clara Whitmore had lost her mind, and something needed to be done before she completely destroyed her family's standing in the community. Meanwhile, Clara herself was blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her name. She had indeed been visiting Danny's ranch, drawn by a curiosity about his world that grew stronger with each passing day. The first visit had been spontaneous, an impulse born from restlessness and the memory of his honest words about finding purpose in meaningful work. She had ridden out one afternoon when her parents believed she was paying a social call to the rector's wife, taking a route through the hills that would hide her destination from casual observers. The Hayes Ranch was smaller than she had expected, its buildings practical rather than impressive, but there was something about the place that spoke to her in ways the manicured perfection of her father's estate never had. Danny had been repairing a section of fence when she arrived, his shirt sleeves rolled up and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. The sight of him working with such focused intensity had stopped her short, making her realize how rarely she had seen anyone in her social circle actually engaged in productive labor. "Miss Whitmore," he had said when he noticed her approach, straightening up with the kind of surprise that suggested he hadn't expected to see her again after the tense conclusion of the dinner party. "Is everything all right?" "I wanted to see your ranch," she had replied simply, dismounting from her mare with the fluid grace that years of riding lessons had ingrained in her movements. "You spoke about it with such pride at dinner, and I realized I've never actually seen how a working ranch operates." The request had clearly made him uncomfortable, his awareness of social proprieties warring with natural hospitality and something else that might have been pleasure at her interest in his life's work. In the end, curiosity and courtesy had won, out over caution, and he had spent the next 2 hours showing her around his modest operation. Clara had been fascinated by everything from the way he read the health of his cattle by observing their behavior to the complex relationship between grazing patterns and soil conservation. She asked questions with the intensity of someone genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply making polite conversation. And Danny found himself explaining aspects of ranch management he had never articulated to anyone else. "You really love this, don't you?" she had asked as they stood watching his small herd graze in the golden light of late afternoon. "I do," he had admitted, surprised by the ease with which he could be honest with her. "It's hard work, and there are no guarantees, but everything I do here matters in a way I can see and measure. When I improve the pasture, the cattle get stronger. When I repair a fence properly, it protects what I've built. There's something satisfying about that direct connection between effort and result." Clara had listened with the kind of attention that made him feel truly heard, and when she finally rode home, as evening approached, both of them understood that something significant had begun between them that went far beyond gratitude for a rescue. The second visit had come a week later, and then a third, each one lasting longer and delving deeper into the realities of ranch life that Clara had never imagined. Danny taught her to read the signs that indicated when cattle needed medical attention, showed her how to identify good grazing land versus poor, and explained the complex economics that made the difference between a profitable year and financial disaster. But more than the practical education, Clara found herself drawn to the authenticity of Danny's world. There was no pretense here, no elaborate social rituals designed to display status rather than accomplish genuine goals. People were valued for their competence and character rather than their family connections or bank accounts, and Clara discovered that she thrived in an environment where her intelligence and curiosity were assets rather than potential liabilities. Danny, for his part, found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that worried him as much as it pleased him. Clara brought a perspective to his world that he had never considered, asking questions that made him think about his work in new ways and offering insights that came from her extensive education, even when applied to unfamiliar subjects. She had an analytical mind that could grasp complex concepts quickly, and her lack of practical experience was more than compensated for by her ability to see patterns and connections that escaped people who were too close to the daily details of ranch management. When she suggested modifications to his cattle feeding schedule based on nutritional principles she had read about in her father's agricultural journals, Danny found that her ideas actually improved his operations' efficiency. But beyond the intellectual connection, there was something else growing between them that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Clara found herself thinking about the way Danny's hands moved when he worked, gentle but sure, capable of delicate tasks like treating an injured animal or precise ones like repairing complicated machinery. She noticed how he spoke to his horses and cattle with the same respect he showed to people, and she was moved by the quiet pride he took in caring for creatures that depended on him completely. Danny was equally affected by Clara's presence, though he tried to maintain the emotional distance that social reality demanded. He admired her courage in questioning the assumptions of her upbringing, her willingness to learn skills that her parents would consider beneath her station, and the genuine kindness she showed to everyone she met, regardless of their social position. Yet both of them were acutely aware that their growing friendship existed in a precarious space between worlds, threatened constantly by the expectations and prejudices of the society they lived in. The awareness added an urgency to their interactions that made every conversation more intense, every shared moment more precious, because they both understood how easily it could all be taken away. The crisis came on a crisp October morning when Clara arrived at the ranch to find Danny struggling with a problem that tested every skill he possessed. One of his mares had gone into labor during the night, but the foal was positioned incorrectly, creating a dangerous situation that required immediate intervention. The local veterinarian was traveling to another county and wouldn't return for days, leaving Danny to handle the emergency alone. "I can't leave her like this," he explained tersely when Clara offered to ride for help. "If the foal isn't repositioned soon, we'll lose them both." Without hesitation, Clara dismounted and rolled up her sleeves, ignoring the damage that assisting with a difficult birth would do to her expensive riding habit. "Tell me what to do," she said simply. What followed was 3 hours of intense, exhausting work that tested both their physical limits and their ability to function as a team under extreme pressure. Danny's knowledge of animal anatomy and birthing complications, combined with Clara's steady hands and unflinching determination, to create a partnership that ultimately saved both mare and foal. When the healthy colt finally took his first shaky steps, both Danny and Clara were covered in sweat and barn dirt, their expensive clothes ruined and their careful social boundaries completely forgotten. They sat against the barn wall, watching the new mother nuzzle her offspring, and Clara felt a satisfaction deeper than anything she had ever experienced in her carefully orchestrated life. "Thank you," Danny said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. "I couldn't have managed that alone." "Neither could I," Clara replied, and they both understood she was talking about more than just the difficult birth. They had accomplished something together that neither could have achieved alone, had worked with a coordination that spoke of deep trust and mutual respect. It was then, sitting in the barn with hay in her hair and blood on her sleeves, that Clara realized she was in love with this man who had shown her what authentic living could look like. The recognition hit her with the force of physical impact, making her breath catch and her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with their recent exertion. Danny must have seen something in her expression, because his own face changed, the careful distance he had maintained dissolving as he read the truth in her eyes. For a moment, the barn was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of the mare and her newborn foal, and the air between them crackled with possibility and danger, in equal measure. "Clara," he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before, intimate and precious, and full of unspoken longing. She leaned toward him, drawn by forces stronger than social convention or family expectation. And he met her halfway. Their first kiss was gentle but intense, tasting of hard work and shared accomplishment, and the kind of connection that couldn't be manufactured or arranged by well-meaning parents. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara saw her own wonder and fear reflected in Danny's eyes. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had admitted feelings that would complicate their lives in ways neither fully understood yet. "This changes everything," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Clara replied, but there was no regret in her tone, only determination, "and I'm glad it does." They might have said more, might have tried to work through the implications of what had just happened between them, but the sound of approaching horses interrupted their private moment. Danny was on his feet instantly, his body tense as he recognized the purposeful cadence of multiple riders approaching at speed. Through the barn door, they could see a group of men riding into the ranch yard, with the kind of grim determination that meant serious trouble. Theodore Whitmore was in the lead, his face dark with anger, flanked by Sheriff Coleman and two other men Clara recognized as prominent ranchers who served as informal enforcers of community standards. "Stay behind me," Danny said quietly, positioning himself between Clara and the approaching confrontation. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he kept mounted near the barn door, then stopped as he realized that armed resistance would only make an already impossible situation worse. Theodore Whitmore dismounted with sharp, angry movements, his eyes taking in his daughter's disheveled appearance and drawing exactly the conclusions that Danny had feared. "Clara," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "you will come with me immediately." "Father," Clara began, stepping out from behind Danny with her chin raised in defiance, "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," Theodore cut her off. "Your behavior has become the talk of the entire county. Do you have any idea what people are saying about our family, about you?" Sheriff Coleman, a weathered man in his 50s who had known Clara since she was a child, looked uncomfortable with his role in the confrontation, but determined to carry out his duty. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "your parents are concerned about your welfare. They've asked me to escort you home safely." It was a polite fiction that fooled no one. This wasn't a rescue. It was an intervention designed to end Clara's association with Danny before it could develop further. The presence of the other ranchers made it clear that community pressure had forced Theodore's hand, that his daughter's behavior was being seen as a threat to the social order that kept their world functioning. "I don't need to be rescued," Clara said, her voice steady despite the intimidating presence of the men arrayed against her. "I'm here because I choose to be here, learning about work that matters and spending time with someone who treats me as an equal rather than a decoration." Her words hit the assembled men like physical blows, challenging assumptions about women's roles and proper behavior that none of them had ever questioned. The silence that followed was charged with tension that could explode into violence if not carefully managed. Danny stepped forward, his manner respectful but unintimidated. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, "your daughter has done nothing wrong. She's been learning about ranch management, asking intelligent questions, and helping with legitimate work. If that's become controversial, then maybe the controversy is with the people doing the talking, not with Miss Whitmore's actions." It was a carefully worded defense that avoided any mention of their growing feelings while asserting Clara's right to make her own choices about how she spent her time. But Theodore Whitmore was beyond listening to reasonable explanations. His anger fueled by days of social pressure and the fear that his daughter was destroying her future prospects through association with a man far beneath her station. "My daughter," he said with deadly calm, "will not be visiting your ranch again. Any attempt to contact her or encourage further meetings will result in serious consequences. Do I make myself clear?" The threat was unmistakable, backed by the kind of economic and social power that could destroy a small rancher's livelihood without leaving fingerprints. Danny understood perfectly that he was being offered a choice between Clara's happiness and his own survival, between love and everything he had worked to build. Clara started to protest, but Danny caught her eye and shook his head slightly. He had lived his entire life in this community and understood the realities of power in ways that her privileged upbringing had shielded her from. This wasn't a battle that could be won through defiance or noble gestures. It required strategy and patience and careful consideration of consequences that would affect more than just the two of them. "I understand your position, sir," Danny said formally, his words chosen to avoid either submission or further provocation. Theodore nodded sharply, apparently satisfied that his message had been received. "Clara," he said, turning to his daughter with expression that brooked no argument, "you will come home now, and this foolishness will end." Clara looked at Danny, her eyes asking questions that he couldn't answer in front of her father and the other men. The pain in her expression nearly broke his resolve to handle the situation diplomatically, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Go with your father," he said quietly, his voice carrying meanings that only she could read. "This isn't the time or place for arguments that can't be won." She nodded reluctantly, understanding that he was asking her to trust him to find another way forward, to believe that this forced separation wasn't the end of their story, but merely a temporary setback in a longer campaign. As she mounted her horse and prepared to leave with her father's party, Clara turned back for one last look at the man who had changed her understanding of what life could offer. Danny stood in the barn doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dark interior where their shared work had revealed possibilities neither had imagined before. The ride back to the Whitmore estate was conducted in tense silence, father and daughter each lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation and its implications for their future relationship. But as they crested the hill that looked down on the family mansion, Clara made a silent promise to herself that her parents' intervention was a setback, not a defeat. She had tasted authentic love and meaningful work, had discovered capacities within herself that her sheltered upbringing had never revealed. Whatever consequences awaited her at home, whatever restrictions her parents tried to impose, she would find a way back to the life she had glimpsed in Danny's world. The battle for her future was just beginning. The winter that followed was the longest of Clara's life, each day stretching endlessly within the confines of a house that had become her elegant prison. Her parents, believing they had successfully ended what they saw as a dangerous infatuation, had imposed restrictions that would have been appropriate for a child rather than a woman of 22. Clara was forbidden from riding alone, required to have a chaperone for any venture beyond the estate grounds, and subjected to a constant stream of suitable young men who arrived for carefully orchestrated social visits. But isolation had only strengthened Clara's resolve. During the long evenings when she was expected to entertain potential suitors with piano performances and polite conversation, her mind wandered to memories of dusty barns and honest work, of calloused hands gentle enough to help birth a foal, and strong enough to repair whatever life had broken. The contrast between Danny's authentic presence and the manufactured charm of her approved visitors only made her more certain that she had found something worth fighting for. Meanwhile, Danny faced his own challenges as winter tightened its grip on the high country. The social pressure that had forced the confrontation at his ranch continued in more subtle but equally effective ways. Suppliers who had always been reliable suddenly had difficulty fulfilling his orders. The bank, under Theodore Whitmore's influence, began requiring additional documentation for routine transactions. Fellow ranchers who had once offered neighborly assistance became distant and unavailable when he needed help with tasks that required multiple hands. The message was clear. His association with Clara Whitmore had marked him as someone who had forgotten his place in the community's social structure, and the consequences would continue until he either left the county or accepted his isolation. As the price of his presumption, yet Danny found that the hardships only clarified his feelings rather than weakening them. Every obstacle placed in his path reminded him of what he was fighting for. Every snub from former friends reinforced his conviction that a life with Clara was worth whatever sacrifices it might require. He had always been self-reliant by necessity, but now his independence became a conscious choice, a rejection of a community that valued conformity over character. As winter deepened into the hardest freeze in decades, both Clara and Danny discovered resources within themselves that neither had known existed. Clara used her extensive education to research legal precedents for women's property rights, spending hours in her father's library learning about inheritance laws and the limited but real options available to women of means who chose to live independently. Danny expanded his operation despite the social boycott, finding suppliers in distant towns and developing relationships with cattle buyers who cared more about the quality of his livestock than his social standing. By February, when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the mountains seemed to touch the sky, both had reached the same conclusion through different paths. If society would not accept their love within its current structure, then they would have to create a new structure that made room for what they had found together. The opportunity came with the spring thaw, when news reached Millbrook County that the government was opening new territories in Montana for homesteading. Young families were needed to establish communities in regions where social hierarchies had not yet crystallized, where a person's worth would be measured by their ability to survive and thrive rather than by their family connections or bank balances. Danny heard about the homestead opportunity from a cattle buyer who had become one of his few remaining business contacts, a man who spoke admiringly of the courage required to start fresh in untested country. Clara learned about it from a magazine article she discovered while researching women's legal rights, a piece that described successful female homesteaders who had proven that determination and intelligence could overcome any lack of formal agricultural training. Neither knew that the other had learned about the Montana territories, but both began making quiet preparations for a journey that would represent either the beginning of everything they had dreamed of or the end of everything they had known. Clara's preparations were necessarily secretive, conducted under the pretense of organizing her personal belongings and updating her wardrobe for the spring social season. She sold jewelry piece by piece through a trusted servant, converting her inheritance into cash that could be easily transported. She studied maps and railroad schedules, learning the routes that would take her far from Colorado and her father's influence. Most importantly, she researched the legal requirements for establishing her own homestead claim, discovering that unmarried women had the same rights as men to claim and develop frontier property. Danny's preparations were more straightforward, but equally challenging. He quietly sold his ranch to a buyer from outside the county, accepting a price below market value in exchange for a quick, confidential transaction. He converted his livestock and equipment into cash and supplies suitable for establishing a new operation in country where everything would have to be built from scratch. Most difficult of all, he began the process of mentally severing connections to the only community he had ever known, accepting that his choice to love Clara Whitmore meant abandoning not just his current life, but his entire past. The critical moment came on a warm April morning when Clara's latest approved suitor, the son of a mining magnate from Denver, arrived for what her parents hoped would be a proposal visit. Harold Pemberton was everything Theodore and Martha Whitmore had dreamed of for their daughter: wealthy, well-educated, socially prominent, and sufficiently infatuated with Clara's beauty to overlook what they portrayed as a temporary rebellious phase. Clara sat in the parlor, listening to Harold's carefully rehearsed proposal, watching his face as he spoke of their future, together with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that money and social position could purchase anything, including love. He described the mansion he would build for her in Denver, the elaborate social calendar they would maintain, the children who would inherit both their fortunes and their elevated status in Colorado society. "I understand you've had some unconventional interests lately," Harold said with the indulgent smile of someone addressing a child's amusing but temporary fascination. "But marriage will give you proper outlets for your energy. Charitable work, organizing social events, perhaps even some writing if you're so inclined. There are many ways for a woman of your education to make meaningful contributions within appropriate boundaries." As Clara listened to Harold reduce her dreams of authentic living to acceptable hobbies for a wealthy wife, she felt something crystallize within her that had been building throughout the long winter months. She understood with perfect clarity that this man represented not just a marriage proposal, but a choice between two completely different ways of existing in the world. She could accept Harold's offer and live comfortably within the expectations of her social class, surrounded by luxury and security, but forever wondering what might have been if she had chosen courage over convention, or she could reject everything her parents had planned for her and risk everything on the possibility that love and determination could create a life worth living. Even if that life included hardships her privileged upbringing had never prepared her to face. "Harold," she said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that made him stop mid-sentence in his description of their future home's ballroom. "I'm honored by your proposal, but I must decline. I've realized that I want something very different from life than what you're offering." The rejection was gentle but absolute, delivered with such calm finality that Harold seemed genuinely shocked. He had expected some initial resistance, perhaps even enjoyed the prospect of persuading a spirited woman to accept his suit, but he had never considered the possibility of outright refusal. "I don't understand," he said, his confidence wavering, for the first time since Clara had known him. "What could you possibly want that I can't provide? My family's fortune is considerable, our social connections unparalleled, our future prospects unlimited." "I want to matter," Clara replied simply. "I want to build something with my own hands, to face real challenges, to know that my life has made a difference in ways that can't be measured by bank balances or social invitations." Harold's bewilderment was complete, his worldview challenged by concepts he had never encountered. In his experience, women wanted security and luxury and social position, not the uncertain rewards of meaningful labor. Clara's rejection represented not just personal disappointment, but a fundamental challenge to assumptions he had never questioned. When Clara informed her parents of her decision, their reaction was swift and devastating. Theodore Whitmore's face went through several shades of red before settling on a pale fury that was somehow more frightening than explosive anger would have been. "You have lost your mind," he said with deadly calm. "Harold Pemberton represents the finest match available to a woman in your position. His family controls mining interests throughout the state. His connections extend to the highest levels of government and business. His personal character is beyond reproach." "I don't love him, Father," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her hands. "I respect him. I'm grateful for his interest, but I don't love him and I never will." And Bill, Martha Whitmore chose that moment to demonstrate the emotional manipulation that wealthy women had perfected over generations of getting their way through indirect pressure. She collapsed into a chair with theatrical grace, pressing a lace handkerchief to her eyes as she spoke of family honor and social responsibility and the ingratitude of daughters who rejected the sacrifices their parents had made to provide them with advantages. "After everything we've given you," she said between carefully timed sobs, "this is how you repay us, by throwing away the finest marriage prospect in Colorado for some romantic fantasy about that ranch hand." The mention of Danny made Clara's resolve even stronger, clarifying what she was fighting for and why no amount of guilt or pressure could change her mind. "Danny Hayes is the finest man I've ever known," she said with quiet pride. "He's honest and hard-working and treats me as an equal rather than a possession. If loving him is a romantic fantasy, then I prefer fantasy to the reality you're offering." The battle that followed lasted 3 days and included threats, bribes, emotional blackmail, and ultimately the kind of ultimatum that parents had used for generations to control rebellious children. Clara would accept Harold Pemberton's proposal and abandon any thoughts of the ranch hand who had corrupted her judgment, or she would be cut off from her family completely, disinherited and forbidden from ever returning to the only home she had known. "Think carefully about what you're choosing," Theodore warned on the final morning of their confrontation. "Harold is a good man who offers you a secure future. The alternative is poverty and hardship, with someone whose feelings for you are probably based more on your father's bank account than on genuine affection." It was a cruel suggestion designed to undermine Clara's confidence in Danny's motives, and for a moment she felt the doubt that her father intended. But then she remembered the way Danny had looked at her during their first kiss, the reverence in his touch when he checked her for injuries after the horse accident, the patience he had shown in teaching her about work that mattered to him. Those memories belonged to a man who had fallen in love with her spirit rather than her social position, and they gave her the strength to make the choice that would change her life forever. "I've thought very carefully," she said, meeting her father's eyes with steady determination, "and I choose love over security, authentic living over comfortable pretense. I choose Danny Hayes and whatever future we can build together." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence, marking the end of Clara's life as the dutiful banker's daughter and the beginning of something entirely unknown. Her parents' reactions were immediate and final. She had 24 hours to pack whatever belongings she could carry and leave their home forever. Clara spent her last night in the mansion that had been her entire world, walking through rooms filled with memories and expensive objects that had once seemed important, but now felt like beautiful artifacts from someone else's life. She packed practical clothing and a few precious books, left behind the jewelry and elaborate dresses that belonged to a person she no longer wanted to be, and wrote letters to be delivered after her departure, explaining her choices to the few friends who might understand. Just before dawn, she slipped out of the house that had shaped her but could no longer contain her, carrying a single suitcase and more determination than she had known she possessed. She walked the 5 miles to Danny's ranch through the pre-dawn darkness, guided by stars and the certainty that she was moving toward the life she was meant to live, rather than away from the one that had been chosen for her. Danny was already awake, feeding his horses in preparation for the day's work, when he heard familiar footsteps approaching through the morning mist. He turned to see Clara walking toward him, with the calm confidence of someone who had made an irrevocable decision and found peace in the choosing. "I told my parents I won't marry Harold Pemberton," she said without preamble, setting down her suitcase and meeting his eyes with the kind of directness that had attracted him from their first conversation. "I told them I choose you and whatever life we can make together." Danny studied her face in the growing light, reading the cost of her decision in the slight shadows under her eyes and the careful way she held herself, as if she might shatter if she relaxed her control. But he also saw something new in her expression, a freedom that came from finally acting on convictions rather than simply harboring them. "That couldn't have been easy," he said quietly, crossing the space between them and taking her hands in his. "What did they say?" "That I'm no longer their daughter," Clara replied, and though her voice remained steady, Danny felt the slight tremor in her fingers that revealed the pain beneath her composure. "That I'm disinherited and forbidden from returning home." The magnitude of what she had sacrificed for him hit Danny like a physical blow. Clara had given up everything she had ever known, everything that had provided her with security and identity, based on faith in a future they had never even discussed in practical terms. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you should know that I've been planning to leave Colorado. There are homestead opportunities in Montana, a chance to start fresh where nobody knows our history or cares about the social rules we've broken here." Her eyes lit up with excitement rather than fear, and Danny realized that Clara had been hoping for exactly this kind of new beginning. "When do we leave?" she asked, and the simple question contained a universe of trust and shared purpose. "We can be married this morning and on the train to Montana by evening," Danny replied, "if you're sure that's what you want." Clara's answer came in the form of a kiss that was deeper and more certain than their first, a physical promise that matched the emotional commitment they were making to each other and to the unknown future they would face together. They were married that afternoon by a circuit preacher who asked no questions about family approval or social standing, requiring only that they pledge their lives to each other with honesty and intention. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had packed for the journey, and Danny had borrowed a suit from the preacher's own wardrobe, but neither had ever felt more perfectly dressed for an occasion. By sunset, they were on a train heading north through country that grew wilder and more beautiful with each passing mile. Clara sat beside the window watching unfamiliar landscapes roll past, while Danny held her hand and told her about the homestead he had chosen from maps and government descriptions, the 160 acres where they would build a house and raise cattle and create a life based on their own choices rather than other people's expectations. "Are you scared?" Danny asked as the train climbed into mountain country where snow still capped the highest peaks and the air seemed too pure to breathe. "Terrified," Clara admitted, then turned to look at him with eyes that sparkled with anticipation rather than fear, and more excited than I've ever been in my life. The train carried them through the night toward territory where Clara's education and Danny's practical skills would be equally valuable, where their love could grow without the constant pressure of social disapproval, where the only measure of their success would be their ability to build something meaningful together. Behind them, Millbrook County settled into the comfortable rhythm of familiar scandals and predictable social arrangements. Harold Pemberton eventually married the daughter of a railroad magnate, a union that satisfied everyone's expectations and created no uncomfortable challenges to established hierarchies. The Whitmore family maintained their social position while privately grieving the daughter who had chosen love over security and disappeared into the kind of adventure that proper people discussed only in whispers. But ahead of Clara and Danny lay the Montana territory, where homestead claims waited for people brave enough to start over with nothing but determination and trust in each other. They would face hardships that Clara's privileged upbringing had never prepared her for, experience failures and setbacks that would test every assumption they had made about their own capabilities, but they would face them together, as equal partners in a life they chose rather than accepted. Years later, when their children asked about the early days of their parents' marriage, Clara would tell them about the train ride that carried her away from everything comfortable and familiar toward everything uncertain and wonderful. She would describe the moment when she first saw the land that would become their home. Rolling hills covered with grass that stretched to horizons wider than any she had imagined. And she would remember the certainty she felt that she had finally found the place where her life could matter in ways that couldn't be measured by social standing or family approval. Danny would add his own memories of watching Clara adapt to challenges that would have defeated someone with less courage and determination, of seeing her learn to read weather patterns and cattle behavior with the same intelligence she had once applied to French poetry and piano compositions. He would tell them how their mother had proven that strength came in many forms, that the hands that had once arranged flowers with artistic precision could also deliver calves and mend fences, and build the kind of home where love mattered more than luxury. Their story became the foundation for a different kind of family legacy, one based on choices made for love rather than convenience, on work that mattered rather than wealth that impressed, on the understanding that the greatest inheritance parents could leave their children was the courage to follow their hearts even when the path led away from everything safe and familiar. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up, just click and check them out.